Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. In the previous video we talked about speciation and talked about how species are created through allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. In this video we're going to be really focusing on really the mechanism, the process of how speciation occurs, and that's called reproductive isolation. So in the previous video we learned that, at least for AP Biology, we define a species as members of a population that can mate with each other and produce viable offspring. So reproductive isolation is the existence of barriers to prevent members of two species from producing offspring together. So it's basically what is separating one species from another. Okay, so reproductive isolation limits the formation of hybrids. This is an important term here. What is a hybrid? Hybrids are offspring produced through mating. Okay. So when we talk about reproductive isolation, there's usually we classify them into two categories, pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. Okay. And let's first talk about what a pre-zygotic barrier is. A pre-zygotic barrier is a barrier that prevents fertilization from occurring. You can think of this as before the zygote. What does this term mean? Zygote. You probably know this from pre-AP biology, but if you don't, a zygote is basically the first cell that is created whenever the egg and the sperm cell come together. Okay, so that is a zygote. Okay. So what a pre-zygotic barrier is it's preventing the egg cell and the sperm cell from coming together in order to create the zygote. And when you talk about pre-zygotic barriers, there's usually three ways they can act, okay? The first one is by preventing members of different species from attempting to mate, so this means that there's no mating even occurring. Two, by preventing an attempted mating from successfully completing. And three, by preventing fertilization if mating has already occurred, okay? In contrast to that, you can have a post-zygotic barrier. This is a barrier that occurs after the zygote is already formed, okay? And this usually, when you talk about post-zygotic barriers, you usually talk about developmental errors. So this is like things that are occurring after the zygote is it's created, and it can occur after it can affect a hybrid's chance of survival. So that would be example like, a genetic disease or something like that. And we're going to get more into this so you can actually see examples of post-zygotic barriers. So before we do that, let's first look at the types of pre-zygotic barriers that occur in biology. The first is habitat isolation. So habitat isolation is when two species living in different habitats within the same area stop interacting with each other. Okay? It's important to know that the species are not isolated by physical barriers. This is important. The species are not isolated by physical barriers. So this is habitat isolation is actually an example of sympatric speciation. Okay. This is sympatric speciation. Habitat isolation is not allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation, remember from the previous video, is when you have a group of organisms which are not allopatric speciation, which are isolated from each other because of geography. That's not what this is. Habitat isolation is an example of sympatric speciation because the organisms are not isolated from each other. Let me give you an example. Okay, let's say we have I don't know. Let's say we have this environment with draw a tree here. Okay, and then there's also a river. Okay, and then we have these lizards. Okay, let's say there's a lizard. Oh my god, I'm going to draw a lizard like this. Bear with me. That's a horrible lizard. Okay, that's a lizard. So we have a lizard. We have lizards which live in trees, and we have lizards which like to live near the ground. Okay. I don't know how that's a lizard. I don't know. It's a rat, a lizard, whatever you want to call it. Okay, an organism. So in habitat isolation, obviously these organisms can come and this lizard can come down and it can mate with the lizard down here. But the thing is, what's preventing them from doing that is that the organism here likes to stay near the water for whatever reason, while this likes to stay in um, in the trees. Okay, so there's no physical barrier here. One of them could probably climb up, another one could probably climb down, and they could mate, but they just don't like to do that. So because of that, there's that isolation, and there's no mating. Okay, so that's habitat isolation. Now, temporal isolation. Temporal isolation is when you have this isolation because of time. You know, sometimes species often breed during different times of the day, different seasons, or even different years. So this occurs when the species are not able to mix their gametes with each other. So it's basically, you can think of this as time. Okay, so let me write that down. Time. So they could mate with each other. This is again another example of a symbiotic speciation because there is no physical barrier. But they are still being isolated because of time. Let's say we have an example of just two organisms, like two different types of deer that could probably physically mate with each other, but one of them likes to mate in the fall time while one of them likes to mate in the springtime. Okay, so that time factor is what's isolating both of them. You can also have behavioral isolation. Okay, this again is also an example of symbiotic speciation. Actually, everything I'm talking about in this video is an example of symbiotic speciation, okay? For the record. I'm just going to keep mentioning this. This is also an example of symbiotic speciation, okay? This is when species perform rituals as a method of mate recognition, okay? If you look at National Geography, I don't know if you've ever seen this. You know, let me give an example of this. It's basically behavioral isolation is where like you have to perform this ritual or something like that as a method of mate recognition, and that's preventing the organisms from mating. Okay, so let's say I've seen examples of this in National Geographic. National Geographic. That's the name of that show, where you'll have this like this bird, right? Like the male bird, and the male bird, that is a bird. Okay, the male bird has to give off this performance to a female bird. Okay, like a performance to the female bird before it gets the right to mate. Okay, so this is the male, and it's giving this performance to the female. Okay, and only if it gives let's say a good performance, it'll dance, it'll jump, you know, it does all sorts of things. But only if it gives a good performance is when you get to see. Is only if the male gives a good performance will the female want to mate with the male. Okay, so this is an example of behavioral isolation. Let's say we also had a green male. Okay, draw that. This green male, and it's actually remarkably similar to the red male. However, this green male right here does not know how to give off this performance that the male one does. Okay, so because of that, this female is not going to want to mate with the green male, this green bird here. So that's an example of behavioral isolation. You see that this one has to give the ritual in order to mate with the female here, and the green one can't give that performance, so it's behaviorally isolated from this female. Okay, and they perform very effective barriers. So what this is called is mate recognition. Okay, so this whenever it gives this performance, it's a good way of the female knowing that it's okay for it to mate with this male. Okay, and because of this behavior, it's a very effective reproductive barrier. Okay, behavioral isolation. Remember that. Now, another type of isolation is mechanical isolation. So this is when mating is attempted but can't be completed due to morphological differences. Let me give you an example of that. So this happens actually, I think, in this type of snail. Okay, oh my gosh, let me try to draw this. So these snails have, okay, there's a right-handed snail, and then there's a left left snail, okay? And basically, you know, these snails will attempt to mate with each other, but they can't mate because the parts of, let's say this is the section right here, which needs to come together for the organisms in order for them to mate with each other. But because they have this different shape, one is kind of going in this right-hand direction while this is going in the left-hand direction, or I guess I could say this is like counterclockwise, this is clockwise, whatever you want to call it, because the parts will not fit with each other. The mating cannot be completed. So this is due to morphological differences. If you don't know what this means, this is basically structural differences. Okay, and again, this is an example of sympatric speciation because there's no physical geographical barrier. The only barrier is the barrier in structure. Okay. Now the final type of prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. Gametic isolation occurs when the sperm of one species cannot fertilize with the eggs of another species. So this is basically where the mating does happen, but the genes are just way too different, the genetic information, to a point where the organisms can't mate with each other. For example, let's say like a dolphin try to mate with, I don't know, a whale, you know. So maybe the egg and the sperm cell do come together, right? But the genetic differences between the egg and the sperm are so different that the zygote is not able to form. Okay. So those are prezygotic barriers. Now let's first talk about postzygotic barriers. So again, postzygotic barriers are when the hybrid is created, and the hybrid is, you know, the hybrid actually, the female gives birth to the hybrid, but then the hybrid has issues. Okay. So the first is reduced hybrid viability. Okay. So what this basically is when whenever, let's say we have let's say, not a, I'm going to say we have a male, and then we have a female, okay, and they reproduce, and then they create a hybrid. Okay, so the hybrid is actually, the female gives birth to the hybrid. Okay, so the hybrid is being created. Okay, there's actually, you know, the hybrid is physically existent. It's not just a zygote. However, the hybrid itself has issues. Okay, let's say genetic diseases, you know, or maybe it has a different color or something like that, a different color from the male and the female, and because of that, natural selection is going to select this hybrid, and it's just going to completely kill it, you know, because the different color is, it can't camouflage with the environment or something like that. So the hybrid is just not as successful as the species, the male species and the female, wherever the male came from or wherever the female came from. Okay, so this is basically where the hybrid is created, but it's not viable. That's why we call it reduced hybrid viability, because the hybrid is not able to survive. Okay. Now the next type is reduced hybrid fertility. And oh, by the way, this is also sympatric speciation because there's no physical barrier. Okay, what's preventing it is another factor. This also, reduced hybrid fertility, is example of sympatric speciation. So this is when you have let me see here, you have again the male, and then you have the female, and they reproduce and they create the hybrid just like the first scenario. And in this case the hybrid is fine. Okay, so here we had the genetic diseases, different colors, things like that, which are preventing the hybrid from actually surviving. But in this case here, the hybrid actually can survive. Okay, it can survive. So the hybrid is completely fine. However, the hybrid, let's say there's another scenario where you have the same thing, another male of the same species, another female of a different species come together. And I just want to emphasize that these males and females are not from the same species. They're from different species. Okay. Same thing in this scenario. This is one male from one species and a female from another species. So this male and female come and they create another hybrid. Now this hybrid can also survive. But what happens is that when this hybrid right here, this hybrid right here can't reproduce comes to try to mate with this hybrid right here, that's the second generation hybrid. Let's draw another hybrid here. This hybrid, the second generation hybrid, we say second gen. This is when this thing has developmental errors. So this thing is just like the reduced hybrid viability, except here the first generation hybrid is the one with the genetic diseases or things like that. In this case, the two hybrids are created, but the second generation hybrid has problems. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Whenever a donkey mates with a horse, what will happen is you get a mule. And now a mule is actually very, very useful. You know, mules are used all over the world in order to perform labor. Okay, so they're completely fine. But whenever a mule tries to mate with another mule, like this is going to cause an error. It's just not going to work. When a mule tries to mate with another mule, it's just the fertility. An organism will not be created. Okay, so because of that, this is a reduced hybrid fertility. The mules are fine, but the second generation the hybrid is not able to survive. Now, finally, this is hybrid breakdown. So this is even one step further. So let me do this again. You have a male and a female of different species, and they create a hybrid. And then you have a male and a female from different species, and they also create a hybrid. And these hybrids mate, and they create, let me write this in different colors so you don't get confused here. They create a hybrid, a second generation hybrid. So these hybrids are completely fine. Okay, so there's no errors. This hybrid is also fine. It's able to live well in the environment. However, when the second generation hybrid tries to mate with another hybrid of the second generation, like this, and they try to mate and create a third generation hybrid, this third generation hybrid is going to have issues, you know, it's going to have errors like the genetic diseases, or maybe it's not suited for the environment or something like that. So this is like 3 steps. The male and the female create the hybrid. These hybrids are fine. The hybrids mate with each other and they create another hybrid. These hybrids, second generation, are fine. However, when the second generation hybrids try to mate and create a third generation hybrid, that's when you see the issues, okay? So that's basically it. Before I end this video, I just want to talk about the limitations of this reproductive isolation. Please remember that everything I've talked about here is sympatric speciation. That's an important point because there's no physical barrier. There's another factor which is causing that reproductive isolation. And another thing is the barrier limits, okay? So obviously these limitations here, these barriers, do not apply to organisms that reproduce asexually. For example, prokaryotes, bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. And bacteria, in order for one bacteria to reproduce, all it has to do is split into 2. This process is called binary fission, and you will be learning about this if you haven't already in pre-AP. But in here, in binary fission, you have this one cell which is splitting into 2 cells, okay? As compared to what we saw here in all these examples where there has to be 2 organisms mating. Okay, the reason why this works is that there is an issue whenever the 2 organisms mate. But for prokaryotes, only one organism has to be present in order to reproduce. Okay, so because of that, all these the reproductive isolation, all these barriers which we've talked about in this video, do not apply to organisms which reproduce asexually. Okay, so that's it for reproductive isolation. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the geography on hybrids and really look at something called hybrid zones, so stay tuned. But that's it for now. Reproductive isolation is as simple as that.